Hello, class. I love doing the middle school thing of holding the hand up and getting the eyes up on the front of the classroom. Welcome back. It is February 28th. We are trucking through great decisions. We have 2 more weeks, meaning we have next week and then we have the rescheduled one. Next week, we will have Ron Tamman, who will be talking about China's foreign policy. Ron, of course, is always a fantastic speaker. And if you didn't get the date, we have rescheduled John Kaufman, who's talking about energy independence, for March 28th, which is a Friday at noon. And we will do that at the World Affairs Council offices, 3rd floor, Madison Room at the Historical Society. Because it's a smaller room, we're recommending that you register. It's on our website if you want to go do that. But we're glad we can actually sneak that back in since, the daunting snowpocalypse prevented that from happening. I want to talk about some upcoming things. March 6th, we are going to be doing an International Women's Day program. This is just added yesterday. We are looking at connecting Oregon and the world and invited Leanne Latrell Di Lorenzo of Vote ERA to come and talk. It might seem a little bit of a haphazard connection, but I think that there's a good case to be made that an equal rights amendment could be the next feather in the cap of Oregon's tradition of bold global leadership. It's kind of interesting when you look around that we are 3 states shy federally in terms of being able to have a federal amendment. But I think that when you think about that idea of, thinking globally and acting locally, revolutions do in fact happen in our own backyard first. And I think it's important to point out that the World Economic Forum's gender gap report that came out this last year ranks 134 nations. We rank 23rd, right behind Burundi. We are a point lower than we were the previous year. We are also one of the only industrialized nations not to ratify the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination against UN that the UN, against women that the UN has put together. And we are in very, very good company there, along with Sudan, Somalia, and Iran. So if we could ratify equal rights for women in the Oregon Constitution, it might actually go a long way towards at least setting a good example for everybody else. So that is March 6th, 5:30 p.m. at our offices. March 11th, Masha Gessen, fantastic Russian-American journalist who has written a book called Words Will Break Cement about the punk band Pussy Riot, who, if you followed the Olympics at all, they were recently hassled by the Man again, this time for allegedly stealing a woman's handbag. But Masha Gessen will talk about Pussy Riot as sort of the canary in the coal mine about bigger and broader issues around grassroots democracy and demonstration in Russia. March 18th, I know I've talked about this before, but I'll say it again, Senator Ron Wyden will be speaking at the First Congregational Church at 7 p.m. It's a free talk. Registration is required. You can do that on our website. He's talking about national security, civil liberties, and the surveillance state. I'll remind you that this program is streaming live today. So let's all just say all at once, gee, the federal government is awesome. Thanks. On March 21st, 12 p.m. in our space, we will have TV Paul, who is a security expert on South Asia, talking about the warrior state on Pakistan and the contemporary world. And of course, you probably have all heard about this thing that I've been teasing you about for weeks called the International Speaker Series. Have you all gotten your tickets? Yes. Oh, we love hearing that. We have student tickets available. If you are a PSU student, there are student tickets still available. The upper balcony is entirely sold out. Bless you. But we do have order forms up front if you want to order some tickets. If you haven't ordered your tickets, I will tell you that the series will likely sell out by next week. Which will mean that we probably will not have any individual tickets available. So if you want to see these phenomenal speakers, I would urge you to get the series. And Before we get going on today's program, I want to remind you that, well, A, that we are streaming this live so the world can see what we say in this room. But when we talk about issues around Israel and Palestine, they're very, very polarizing issues. And when we get to the Q&A, I would love it if we could make sure that we have questions and that we keep them brief and we keep them related to the material and the ideas that we have been talking about. It can be very, very easy to allow the emotion of these issues, I think, to overwhelm all of us on whatever side one tends to fall on. But if you can refrain from the polemic and the manifesto and things that don't resemble a question, which is usually 30 seconds or less and has a friendly little question mark at the end, and that would be very, very appreciated. On to today's program, I am very excited. We have Dr. Barbara Tint with us. She is Associate Professor of Conflict Resolution for the Conflict Resolution grad program here at PSU, where she has taught since 1999. She previously served as the program's Assistant Director and Director of International and Intercultural Conflict Resolution. She also serves as an affiliated professor at the Conflict Resolution program at the University of Oregon Law School. As a Rotary Peace Scholar, her doctoral work at the University of Melbourne in Australia explored issues of collective memory and conflict resolution within the context of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. She's also engaged in educational, media, peace-building, and bi-communal projects related to Arab-Jewish relations within the State of Israel. She went to India on a Fulbright assignment to aid in the development of a peace and conflict resolution center at the University of Madras, not to be confused with Madras, Oregon. But they could probably also use some peace and conflict resolution as well. In addition to her teaching, she works as a consultant, facilitator, mediator, and trainer in a variety of domestic and international arenas, including Australia, Costa Rica, Ethiopia, India, Israel, Palestine, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, and other indigenous, refugee, and multiracial groups in the U.S. Her current research and engaged projects include the design and implementation of dialogue and reconciliation processes within refugee communities, and she has a book in the works called Diasporas in Dialogue. When is it coming out?
Probably after the first of the year.
There you go. Mark it down. Order it from Powell's. She is involved in peace-building, development, and sustainability initiatives, and she chairs the advisory board for Community Friends, an NGO in Sri Lanka. She has worked with many of our friends, including Mercy Corps and ERCO, the United Nations University for Peace, and UNESCO. And we are very, very pleased to have her here. So give Dr. Barbara Tint a hand.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you for spending Friday sunny afternoon with me. Can you hear me okay? Yes. So an entire class of my students just walked in. Make sure you all have seats back there. I don't want you standing on my behalf. Find seats. Come on down. It's okay. So when Tim first asked me to do this talk, is that okay? My first inclination was to run as fast as I could, given the nature of the topic and the volatility. I have been involved in this conflict for many, many years, and we all know how passionately people feel about it and polarizing it is. And then I thought, well, I guess if somebody's got to do it, I might as well do it, and talk about it from the conflict resolution perspective. We have historians talking about this conflict. We have political scientists talking about this conflict. We have other kinds of political analysts talking about this conflict, and everybody's got a different perspective. So I'm going to talk about it from the conflict resolution perspective. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, because I also believe that when you are listening to somebody talk about something, it's very useful to know their lens and a little bit about their story. So I am an American Jew. I was raised with the American Jewish narrative that all Arabs hated us. At the age of 16, I went to Israel with a group of other Jewish students, and on July 4th, 1975, was caught in Jerusalem in the middle of a bombing that killed 13 people and injured some of my friends, shattered the terrace off of my room, everything went upside down. And I remember very vividly standing around that night when we were all gathered processing what happened, that I didn't have the feelings of those bad guys, or, let's get them. I remember very strongly crying and weeping and asking over and over, why? Why do people do these things to each other? I couldn't understand from the perspective of a young girl why people would do these things to each other. Fast forward many years later, and I am a peace psychologist. I work in the area of peace and conflict resolution. My discipline is psychology. I have, as you heard, did my PhD on collective memory and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I've done a lot of Arab-Jewish dialogue. I lived at Neve Shalom, Wahat el-Salam for a summer, which is the coexistence village in Israel. I am currently on the board of a foundation that supports bilateral projects within the state of Israel, working with the Arab minority and Jewish majority within the state of Israel. So that's my story, that's my perspective. And I am both blessed and cursed with the ability to see all sides to an issue. That's what makes me a good conflict resolver and probably what makes me a very bad decision maker. So, he who only knows one side of a thing knows little of that. It's an African proverb. I've worked with African refugee communities. Come on in, it's okay, just come on in. It's the rest of my students, oh my God, come on, come on. So what I'm going to ask us to do in our discussion today, and I hope very much that we have a discussion, I'll talk for a little while, and then we will open it up for discourse, is that we try to understand perspectives that are different from our own. As we know, this conflict is very polarizing. And when we are asked to consider perspectives that are different from our own, we often feel afraid because we feel at risk for either losing our own perspective or we feel at risk for somehow condoning or justifying a perspective with which we disagree. So I ask us to suspend those fears and enter into this discourse in a way that we are exploring together, that we are having inquiry. So, United States and Israel. These are some pictures that at this point we could probably just sort of create sort of a template, kind of like the Barbie and Ken, coloring books, and just plug in the faces, right? This has been going on for many, many, many years. We have the United States leaders working with the leaders of the Palestinian and Jewish Israeli communities to try to reach a peace settlement. We haven't done so well. I'm looking particularly at the picture of Bill Clinton and Ehud Barak and Arafat looking quite happy and relaxed at Camp David. And in some ways, that to me is one of the most tragic failures, actually, because we were very, very close. In some people's minds, we were very close. In other people's minds, we were not nearly close enough. I was in Israel when those talks were happening. And when they broke down, I was in Tel Aviv. And I had to drive past the airport to get back to Neve Shalom, where I was staying in Wahat el-Salam. And I was meeting with a peace scholar in Tel Aviv, and I wasn't really quite sure, what level of paranoia I should be having, given that the talks had just broke down and Barak and Arafat were on their way home. And this was somebody who had worked in the region for many, many, many years. And I said, should I be worried? And he said, I wouldn't be on the roads right now. And as we know, it was a matter of a month or two before the second intifada broke out. You could feel the pulse. You could feel the intensity of the energy after that talk broke down. So what we see here are clearly a lot of opportunities and a lot of missed opportunities. We have cartoons abounding that show us some of what's going on. So we have Obama now bringing together seemingly reluctant parties. And Kerry saying, let the talks begin. And of course, Netanyahu is sort of hindered by the settlers, and Abbas is hindered by Hamas. What I want to talk about is, to be really clear, when we talk about Israel, who are we really talking about? The Israeli government, right? When we talk about the US, who are we really talking about? US government. When we talk about the Palestinians, who are we really talking about? Right. Palestinian leadership. So what we have to understand is there are a whole lot of other things going on in these societies. I wanted to take a minute and actually poll the audience. How many of you have actually ever been to the region? Oh, right, awesome. How many of you have really strong opinions about what's going on there? Be honest. How many of you have a sense of what you think needs to happen? Okay, well, you need to come down here and talk with me. Okay, great. So we're going to have a great discussion together. So what I want to talk about for a minute is the connection and the disconnection between the different tracks of what's happening in society. So what we have in peace diplomacy language is called track one, diplomacy. Some of you are familiar with this, which is high-level diplomatic official level negotiations. Track two are citizen influentials, people in clergy, people in media, academics, people like me who go and do workshops and trainings and dialogue with other people in society who have a bit of influence. And then there's track three, which is the grassroots level, where there are things happening in many, 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 many arenas. So one of the things we know is that the government does not always represent the voice of the people, right? So in a democracy, 49.9% of the people or more can be very, very, very unhappy with what's happening in the leadership. When I was living in India, it was right after we invaded Iraq, and I was personally held responsible everywhere I went for our government's decision to invade Iraq, because I was the representation of that decision. So one of the things I want to talk about is, even though our talk today is about Israel and the US, and we are going to be looking at governmental issues and governmental decisions, the other segments of society are alive and well. They're alive and well, and things are happening in civil society, things are happening at the grassroots level that are very, very strong and very, very powerful, and often not represented by what the leadership is doing. So we want to keep that in mind, and we want to keep that in mind as we think about our thoughts for the future. So this is the story we hear about a lot, right? We have Jewish Israelis, we have Palestinians, and we have conflict, we have war. We have people facing off, literally and figuratively. This is also part of the story, that people are reaching across conflict lines. And it's not just about a feel-good hug, right? There are people working tirelessly together in bilateral organizations shared by Jewish and Palestinian community members to work on a just peace for both Palestinians and Jewish Israelis. Okay, this is happening all over. In my field, as my students well know, we're supposed to be neutral, theoretically, right? Conflict resolvers, at least in the West, which we know is only one part of the world, are supposed to enter conflicts without an agenda of their own, without an attachment to the conflict, without benefits or rewards that come to them from the conflict. In many cultures, that is actually not the way it's done. It is often elders or people who are very much involved or aligned with the conflict that will be involved in resolving the conflict. So what do we have here? We have the United States has been a broker for peace in the Middle East. I think it would be challenging, if not impossible, to consider the United States neutral. The United States has an alliance to Israel. We know that. It has a military alliance. It has, at least politically, through many of the presidents in the past, a strong alliance to Israel. So we know that the United States' ability to broker this peace is already framed within that context. The Palestinians know it, feel it, and at the same time, the United States has a huge amount of power. We have a tremendous amount of power, therefore we are able to be involved and broker these peace agreements. One of my favorite quotes is from Desmond Tutu. And he says, when an elephant is about to step on a mouse, the mouse does not appreciate your neutrality. Okay. The tricky thing about this conflict is that all sides feel like the mouse. Now, this is where people are like, yeah, but what about, and we get into our very passionate beliefs about what's going on, and we'll talk about that. And also what we know is that all sides feel like the mouse in different ways. And so what's happening in this conflict is we have what's called a competition of victimhoods, where people are battling out to determine who in some way is a bigger victim. And you can go back as far as you want to find that answer. Now, clearly, this is not an argument that anybody's going to win. So just to give you sort of a visual of some of that, well, I have some maps here to look at the region. Right? So this is a map of the Middle East. Probably most of you are familiar with this in some way. And there's Israel, right? You can all see it. I have a pointer here. There it is. Okay. There's Israel in the Middle East. There is the West Bank and Gaza. And there's Israel. Smaller, more focused map. Okay? Now, we know that any image, any map, any story can be portrayed in a way that supports the agenda that it wants to portray. So there's another one. Can you find it? It's kind of like, where's Waldo? There it is. Right? So for some people, this is the story. Right? This is the story. Israel is this tiny little country surrounded by a large number of Muslim and often very hostile countries. They feel like the mouse. And there is Palestine. Okay, sorry, the image is not very good, right? So 46, 47, 48 to 67, in 2012, that's with all the settlement activity. So who's the mouse? One of the things that conflict resolution requires us to do is to hold conflicting truths simultaneously. It's difficult, and it's necessary. So it doesn't become one right and one wrong. I had a friend who worked in the region for a number of years with an NGO in Palestine during the post-Oslo years, and she came back and she said, you know, there are no good guys and there are no bad guys. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about features of conflict. And we have what we call subjective and objective features of conflict, right? So if you think about this conflict, the objective features of conflict are the borders, statehood, the settlements, right of return, Jerusalem. Those are very concrete issues. The subjective issues are security, acknowledgement, emotional attachment to what's happening, identity. This is an identity-based conflict, which means even if there were a settlement today, you have entire societies of people who have grown and developed with conflict and animosity as part of their identity. The tricky thing about these kinds of conflicts is that first, that the objective parts of the conflict are perceived very differently by different people, so of course they become subjective. And we confuse the two. We see the subjective dimensions of the conflict as fact. So it makes it very, very, very difficult. Very, very difficult to resolve the conflict and very, very difficult to understand perspectives that are different from the ones that you hold. Emotions carry this conflict deeply. Both societies are carrying collective trauma. So what you have typically, right, I mean, there are many emotions in both of these societies, or all of these societies, but typically in the Jewish narrative, there's a tremendous amount of fear. And typically in the Palestinian narrative, there's a lot of rage and humiliation. Not that the Palestinians don't feel fear, and not that the Jews also don't feel rage, but those are the dominant narratives. Those are the dominant emotional narratives in these conflicts. So one of the things we have to understand when we look at the attempts to resolve this conflict is what is being addressed. And one of the failures, it seems to me, in the attempts to resolve these conflicts is that it has addressed the objective features, but not so carefully the subjective features. Issues of emotion, issues of identity. Security is something that's talked about all the time. It's talked about all the time. But what is secure and what feels secure are not the same thing. So that if there are secure borders by some external standard and you still have a group of people feeling insecure, do you have security? I would argue no. Okay. That is an apple pie, and that's a coincidence because, of course, it's an American metaphor, but it's really also a symbol referring to the concept of zero-sum thinking. It's a term that many of you are familiar with. Those of you who are not, I will explain. Zero-sum is a philosophy that basically talks about a finite amount of something. We have winners and losers. The more you get, the less I get. The more I get, the less you get. It's a finite amount. We take another piece of pie away, the other side loses more. One of the things that is happening in this conflict is that issues like identity, security, recognition, and even emotional health are being seen as a zero-sum phenomenon, which means that if you have identity, then my identity is at risk. If you have security, my security is at risk. And it seems to me that we're at a crossroads right now. We're at a crossroads. We're waiting for the Kerry plan. We're waiting for the next round of talks. And clearly, we are at an opportunity point to begin to think of things differently. I'm going to read to you something that Abbas just said. He said, he was just interviewed by Thomas Friedman for the New York Times, and he said, a long-term NATO presence is an acceptable way to reassure the Israelis and to protect us. So he's saying that an indeterminate amount of time for NATO forces to stay in the region after a settlement is acceptable. And what he says, and this is where he's beginning to challenge zero-sum thinking, do you think we have any illusion that we can have security if the Israelis do not feel that they have security? So this is a visionary thinker who understands that their own security is dependent on the security of the other. This has not necessarily been the kind of thinking that has driven a lot of the peace talks. Okay, so in order to get there, we need more thinking like that. We need more thinking that is both and thinking, not either or thinking. In the article that you may or may not have read, Obama does this. Okay, Obama spoke to some Israeli students in March of 2013, and he said two things. He said, I believe that Israel is rooted not just in history and tradition, but also in a simple and profound idea, the idea that people deserve to be free in a land of their own. And Israel has achieved this even as it has overcome relentless threats to its security. So if he had stopped there, he would have made one group of people very happy, right? But he didn't stop there. He said, the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and just must also be recognized. Neither occupation or expulsion is the answer. Just as Israelis built a state in their homeland, Palestinians have a right to be a free people in their own homeland. So he said both. He said both and. So you can have two groups of people who are happy or two groups of people who are terrified. Because as soon as he acknowledges the one, does it negate his support of the other? I would hope not. I would hope not. What we have is a tremendous amount of history. Okay, so I did my PhD dissertation on collective memory. I had come to this work actually as a psychologist, as a family therapist. And when I moved more into political psychology, I was interested in the intergenerational transmission of trauma and the intergenerational transmission of conflict and how people and groups internalize their history. And I was quite surprised, actually, to find out that a lot of the conflict resolution literature didn't really talk about it. They just sort of said, yeah, you know, the past is important, but you got to look forward and we got to, you know, deal with now. And I thought, wow, well, good luck with that. Right? You have entire societies that have spent tens and hundreds and in some cases thousands of years cycling around this conflict. So even when we talk about history, how do we talk about history and know which history we're going to talk about? When I was trying to write about this conflict, I realized that the only way I could write any historical events was to make sure that any event that I wrote about was acknowledged in both Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian documents, websites, books, articles. Because we know that history can be shaped and twisted and turned, and that the narrative then becomes part of the story and the conflict itself. So it's the teller and the telling of the history that creates the present and the future. We have textbooks in Israel right now that are being rewritten to readdress some of the historical stories that have been told. And I can talk about textbooks on both sides that actually really have worked toward contributing to the conflict. And so what we need to do, hello? Am I okay? Okay. Okay. All right. So there are people working on new textbooks as a way to think about what education is doing to these entire societies. We know that children growing up in these societies are learning their narratives from school, they're learning it from their families, and they're learning it from the media. Okay, these are the three main areas where we get our historical and national stories. If the government is in control of the media and education, you know, kind of 2 out of 3 are locked. So we really need to think about where these messages are coming from. And what I do know about conflict and people who question the narrative on either side is that when there's a gap in the narrative that they're getting from different sources, they are more likely to question some of that information. If you're getting the same story from home and from the media, from school, you're not as likely to question it. So we actually have to think about what stories are being told to the people in these societies so that we can actually think about a different future. Okay, so let's get back to the US for a minute, because what we want to think about at this point is the role that US is playing and the role that the US can play in thinking about this conflict. So we know that Israel and the Palestinians have their own interests in this conflict. Do we think the US has its own interests in this conflict? Yes, of course. So let's explore those a little bit and think about how it plays into what's happening in the attempts to resolve this conflict. So one of the things that the US government says it wants is democracy, right? We want democracy. We're spreading democracy everywhere we go. Right? Now, the tricky thing about democracy is that it only works if it gets you people you want, right? Right? I mean, there was a democratic election in the Palestinian community a number of years ago, and Hamas was elected. Right? That's democracy. So what kind of democracy do we want? What kind of democracy is the US government trying to support and perpetrate? I just got back from a trip to Morocco. I'm part of a grant project through the Department of State with the Middle East Partnership Initiative. And the grant does this. The grant, and this has been going on, I think, for about 10 years. So if you multiply the numbers of students that have been involved, it's quite large. The grant every year brings in, I would say, about 140 youth leaders from the Middle East, from 18 Middle Eastern countries. So from Morocco, Egypt, Yemen, Oman, Tunisia, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan. I mean, students from all over the Middle East. And these are students who have applied for this opportunity and, you know, won competitively. They're high-level student leaders in their own communities, and they're chosen by their embassy or their community. And they come to the United States every year for 6 weeks, every summer. And they meet in Washington, D.C. as a large group, and they are hosted by the Department of State. And then they're broken up into 6 groups, and they come to 6 different universities, and Portland State is one. And I'm involved in this project here. And they come to us, and the goal is for them to learn about democracy, civil society. In our case, we teach them conflict resolution. So the goal of this project, you might think, the Department of State is trying to infiltrate the Middle East one youth leader at a time, right? Which in a way is true, right? They're trying to cultivate youth leaders in their own image. What was really interesting about this last visit, so the Morocco trip was all of the students coming back together after the summer from all the different universities and all the university people coming together to revisit their learning, and they all have to do projects at home. And one of the things I realized is that we had a number of students from Israel. We had Palestinian Christians, we had Palestinian citizens of Israel who were both Arab and Christian, but none of the Palestinian or Israeli participants in this grant were Jewish. So I asked the Department of State guy one night at dinner, so I'm curious, is it that it's not open to the Jewish Israelis, or do they just know that it's largely an Arab project, so they don't bother applying? What's going on? And he said, well, we feel that if the Jewish students participated in this project, it would derail everything, and that would become the focus of everything we did. And I thought, well, you're probably right. Right? You're probably right. Now, is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? Do we want the ability to do other kinds of projects? These students are doing amazing projects. They're doing projects on domestic violence. They're doing projects on the environment. They're doing projects on working with the homeless. They're doing projects on all kinds of things in their communities. And one Jewish student in the midst could derail the whole thing. And it's true, because a lot of them are probably not prepared to deal with that. Now, me personally, I'm kind of like, let me at it, right? Let me get my hands on that. I would love that. I would love an opportunity to work with these kinds of students around this issue. But I also know that not everybody would be prepared to deal with that, and I also know that not all the students would be ready to deal with that. So it's a dilemma. It's a dilemma. So I tell you this story because it's a one example of what the US government is doing in the Middle East. And you might say it's biased this way. You might say it's biased that way. I don't really know a lot about what's going on in Washington, D.C. And I'm not sure I really want to know a lot about what's going on in Washington, D.C. because it's at a level that I personally feel challenged impacting. So I actually have to use my sphere of influence, the work that I do, to impact the realms that I can work with. Okay, back to the US. It's about oil, right? We know that. Okay, we know that the US interests in the Middle East, along with many other countries in the US interests in the Middle East, are about oil. It's about reducing nuclear proliferation. Now, Obama did Israel a great favor. Anybody know what he did? He talked about the Iranian nuclear threat as not just a threat to Israel, but a threat to the whole world, that it was a threat to security for the whole world. Now, you may agree or disagree with that, but in saying that, he did Israel a great favor because it legitimized in some way Israel's position on Iran. And we don't know what measures might be taken. But in this case, Obama did Israel a great favor. Public opinion is the new superpower, right? I believe that, actually. I believe that relative to world opinion turning against Israel, turning against the United States, so that increased isolation is a force in this conflict and has to be dealt with, has to be reckoned with. We have seen also the power of social media in creating the Arab Spring. You know, we would not have had the kinds of revolutions and uprisings in the Arab world if it were not for social media. The ability to mobilize large numbers of people in very short amounts of time. So the United States has to understand that if we continue to take a unilateral approach towards supporting Israel, we are going to become more and more and more isolated in that regard. That it has to become both and. It has to become, yes, we're going to support Israel and its security, and the Palestinians need justice. They need their own homeland. They need to be living in conditions that equal humanity. US politicians are concerned about Election Day, right? They know that the decisions they make are going to impact the way the voters perceive them, which is why I feel like we have such an opportunity. It's Obama's second term. He doesn't have to worry about re-election. Hillary Clinton is no longer Secretary of State. She doesn't have to worry about it if she's running for president. That election will drive a lot of what happens in these conflicts or our attempts to intervene. And I think the US government wants two things. This symbolizes two things. It symbolizes peace. Sure, everybody wants peace, right? That is one thing I think we all share. The people in the region with whom I talk to, on all sides, they want peace. It's at what cost are they willing to have it? And under what conditions? So yes, the US government would be quite happy with peace, but also it's about victory. I am quite sure that somebody in this lineage wants to be the one to say, I'm the one who solved it. It's the feather in the current cap. So there's a motivation. There's a motivation to solve this conflict on that level as well. Yes, those are bananas. There's a concept in my work, in peacemaking work, and conflict resolution work called ripeness, which really speaks to if and when a conflict is ripe for being solved. So you can have the best mediators in the world, and you can have all the right things in place, but if a conflict is not ripe, you are not likely to solve it well. So timing is everything. And some of the conditions for ripeness include what's called a way out. That parties begin to see that what they're doing isn't working and they are looking for another way out. There is something called a mutually hurting stalemate, which means people are deadlocked into a stalemate that is hurting everybody. And it is when you are in a mutually hurting stalemate that you are more likely to move, to make decisions, to make concessions, because what you have been trying isn't working, and you are looking for a way out. I would like to think that we are possibly at this stage of ripeness. I don't know. because I've thought we were there before. I only can imagine, being in those positions, and anything would be better than this. But apparently it's not. So the concept of ripeness is something that the US government has to take into account as it's working with this conflict. Sustained peace will be more likely if the different tracks are working together. What we have, track 1, the government is not really, as we talked about before, working in concert with track 2 and track 3 processes very much. Sometimes track 2 actors end up in government, and that is how it influences official decision making. What we really want to look for are processes at all of these levels happening in concert, and intersect with each other. This is for you, Katie. Can I talk about you for a second? Okay. So I have a student, I've just outed, who's doing a thesis on this very topic. Are you a revolutionary or are you a resolutionary? Can you be both? Can you be passionate about a particular side to this conflict and advocate for a particular group of people and also work to resolve it? Or once you're aligned strongly with a group of people on any conflict, does it kind of render you ineffective or useless? I dare us to be both. I dare us to be both. That we can be revolutionaries towards our passion for justice for all people and use that passion and an understanding of what is happening on all sides to achieve resolution. I don't believe we have to choose. Our field has different levels of intervention. Peacekeeping is when you kind of keep people apart after fighting. Peacemaking is what's going on right now, right? Deal making, negotiation, settlement, mediation, negotiation. Peace building is what happens after the deal is made. Because once that deal is made, there is still not peace in that region. We are going to need the US to use its resources, to use its power to support things like bilateral education, like trauma healing, like reconciliation processes, like women's empowerment programs. That is peace building, because those are the kinds of processes that will allow a peace to be sustained after the deal is made. I promise you that if a deal is made and that work isn't done, it won't be long before something pops again. Because you have societies that have been built on trauma. So that's the vision I would like to hold for the future. Some of you may or may not know that the Camp David Accord, where Begin and Sadat came with the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, one of the things that moved that treaty along and moved that deal along is when they showed each other pictures of their grandchildren. They somehow understood that what they were doing was more than just about them. It was about the future generations. They did not want their grandchildren to continue to live in the way that they have. I'm going to read to you a quote from Sadat, who, again, paid with his life, as did Yitzhak Rabin. So the price is often high. We have to decide what price we are willing to pay for peace. But he went to the Knesset. He went to the Israeli Knesset in 1977, and among the many things, and I encourage you to Google this speech, it is magnificent, because it was unbelievable at the time. And one of the things he said, the first fact is that no one can build his happiness at the expense of the misery of others. So I believe strongly and passionately in justice for all people in this region, security for all people in this region. I believe the US has a responsibility with the power that it holds to do the right thing. We know there's going to be a Palestinian state, so get to it. And like it or not, the US is in the mix. It's not neutral, but it's in the mix. So I guess we have about 10 minutes for questions. Thank you.
As per usual, if you have a question, come down, say it into the mic so we can all hear the question, and remember, it is a question.
Thank you very much. A few years ago, I attended a World Affairs Council event here in Portland, and the speaker was retired from the State Department. He was American, he was Jewish. And I was quite surprised that he said that he thought that one of the biggest impediments was that Palestinians living within Israel were not treated as second-class citizens. He said they were treated as third-class citizens or worse. And then also the settlements. Now, you've lived in Israel. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And that is a really, really big and important issue right now. So many of you know that about 20% of the citizens of Israel are Palestinian. They have voting rights. They live as citizens in the state. And it is a very, very big issue and a really pivotal issue, actually. And it's an issue that I'm working on largely right now. I don't know if I could qualify it as second or third rate citizens. I will say that it is an ongoing issue, that the Palestinian citizens of Israel do not live with equivalent rights, and they illegally, yes. I mean, it's like saying racism is finished here in the United States, right? We don't have racism anymore, right? It's illegal. Right, same thing. So we have Palestinian citizens of Israel very much suffering. And there's a lot of good work going on right now related to this. There are organizations called the Abraham Fund, Shatil, Sakui. These are all bilateral Palestinian and Jewish-run organizations in the state of Israel that are working on this particular issue of raising the rights and the standard of living for the Palestinian citizens of Israel. And I will tell you that it's a pivotal issue because if you have 20% of the citizens of Israel who are the Arab citizens who are fulfilled and satisfied with their own government and the lives they're living, they can tip the scales one way. But if they are deeply unsatisfied and move toward resistance, they can very much tip the scales the other way. So it's a very, very big issue. And was the other comment about the settlements?
And also he also said that we don't hear anything about this in the United States because of the political power of AIPAC.
Well, the settlements, again, for those of you who are at all familiar with this issue, are probably one of the biggest impediments to peace, in my opinion. That the settlements continue, even though there have been agreements to stop the settlements, it is creating the erosion of what is still Palestinian communal living and land. And we need Israeli governments to understand that it needs to stop. That is my absolute editorial opinion.
My question was in the same vein, is that I was wondering what you think Netanyahu's options are going forward as he faces the political realities of these settlements, because there's a growing element within his coalition government especially that is pressing for these settlements. And I mean, you gave the image of, there's multiple layers within a country. How is Netanyahu going to negotiate that with the current conflict?
Yeah, I don't know how he's going to negotiate that. If I did, then maybe I'd be over there with him. But I think that there are options. So one of the recommendations for a peace plan that one of my colleagues in this world from Johan Galtung, you may know his name, he's done a lot of writing on this, and he's also somewhat controversial in this conflict. And he talks about having canons, communities in both Israel and Palestine that are in some ways a way to compensate for this dilemma, so that there would be, let's say, 2 Jewish canons in Palestine and 2 Palestinian canons in Israel as a way to deal with the fact that there are settlers. There are political settlers and there are economic settlers. Okay, that's the other thing. There are settlers in the West Bank who are not really there, that they're not motivated by political reasons. They're often immigrants, let's say, from Russia. The government made it very easy for them to build a house there, so the government was motivated politically. But those settlers could probably be swayed pretty easily to move somewhere else if they were given resources to do so. They are not motivated politically the way that other settlers are. But it's probably one of the stickiest points, and I don't have the answer, unfortunately, to what Netanyahu should do. But I think what's becoming clear is that something needs to be different. And again, if you go back to world opinion, Israel cannot afford to be more and more isolated, run the risk of sanctions. which could come if these things don't get addressed. I mean, that's coming.
Since nobody else is.
Might as well.
I was really intrigued by the resolution versus revolution, and maybe your student should speak to this, but I'm just, you look at Ukraine, you look at the Arab Spring, or you look at Occupy Wall Street, you look at our world, it's a wreck. So great business for you, I guess.
Apparently, I'm not doing a very good job.
Unfortunately, but I guess what I'm looking at the situation and saying, I mean, there's no getting around. It's going to blow. I mean, if we think it's bad now in Israel Palestine, it's going to get worse, and things are going to somehow change. But my question is, how can we You look at politics and you say, well, I mean, what am I, an American, to do to stand for justice and human rights in the area if I feel like I'm powerless? And when you talk to Israelis, you talk to Palestinians, people, the average person is like, yeah, I totally live next to them. But I feel like it's the political sphere that prevents that. So I guess the question is, like, how can the people bring resolution without resorting to revolution, or is there no option?
Well, I guess it also depends on what you mean by revolution.
Yeah.
Right? So when I say I believe it can be both, I don't mean that I want people to take up arms and start killing each other. How do we create, how do we create revolution and still break through the zero-sum thinking I talked about? Can I be passionate about advocating for any part of this conflict and understand the needs of the other side? Because if we continue to have polarizing discourse, that's going to create more and more polarization in the conflict. I mean, I'm all kinds of listservs, and I teach about this conflict, and because I'm Jewish, it's a little difficult sometimes for me to teach about this conflict without being seen as an apologist for Israel. Right? So I've been called an apologist for Israel. I've also been called a self-hating Jew. I've been kind of called the whole gamut. So it's really, really challenging. And I'll tell you, no matter what conflict you bring to me, if you're staunchly talking about one side's perspective, I'm going to ask you to look at the other side. No matter what story you're involved in. And it doesn't mean that the needs for justice and the needs for righting wrongs are not what we need to work on. It means we are more successful working on it when there is understanding of all sides. I deeply believe that I will not create change in societies that I work in unless I understand all sides, including the ones that I am most troubled by.
Do you think that bringing the Hasidic into the military will have any effect on Israel's view of, I mean, they're talking about bringing a lot of them in. They're going to find out there's a different world.
Yeah.
And will that help?
Yeah, the question, do you want to say it again?
Yeah, the Hasidic are being brought into the Israeli military now because their proportion has gone from, I think, 1% to 13%. And they're going to see a view of the outside world. They're also seeing it on the internet. And will that change the ultra-right at all?
Hard to say. So right now, the ultra-Orthodox Jews do not have to serve in the military the way that other society members do in Israel. I don't know. My hunch is no. See you later. My hunch is no, that it will not ultimately change the fabric of what's going on. It might change the people involved in that. They might actually have different perspectives based on their experience. Yes, but I don't think that's going to be enough to tip the larger issues one way or another.
I think we have time for
one last question.
I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the recent economic boycotts against Israel and the academic boycotts as well, and if you think those are a viable option, or if you think those can make any headway, or if they're just kind of dead ends.
You know, I understand boycotts, and they've certainly been successful in South Africa and other places, and I also worry about them because they end up hurting the wrong people. Boycotting Iraq years ago, it largely caused deaths among women and children who couldn't get food and formula and things like that. So my concern about boycotts is that it would ultimately it wouldn't hurt the people that we're trying to impact. It would hurt maybe good scholars on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict who are trying to write about it. It would hurt businesses that are run by people who are doing the right thing in this conflict. So I don't know what kind of controls we can use with a boycott to make sure it actually impacts the people that we're trying to reach. That's my response.